Fichter Friday, welcome back. This week I will be discussing a revelation I had while at Revolutions in Speed, hosted by Chris Korfist, Dan Fichter, and Cal Dietz. This is a conference that they hosted up in Minnesota last summer. To fully understand everything that I will be discussing today, I highly suggest that you subscribe to Want to Get Fast on Patreon and purchase any of the resources talked about and discussed today, be it Track and Football Consortium replays or any of Cal's products available on Coach. A potential title for this video could be From Beginner to Cal, because this big revelation that I had was a moment where I thought like, okay, now I could see how you could go from being a beginner, just walking into the weight room, and then a path or a progression to how you could get to all the wild banded exercises that Cal has in his peaking manual or on YouTube. And why this was such a big moment is it really brought together a lot of the things that I've learned from Dan over the years that he's kind of talking about of, hey, you have to be doing this. But then I see all that wild stuff too. And finally, at this conference, I kind of wrote out a progression and laid it all out in my head. Let's go back for a second though, and why was this such a big moment? Why was this such a big revelation that I had at the conference of combining a lot of Dan's stuff with Cal's stuff that I'm seeing on the internet or in his peaking manual? So if you're like me, you're a fan of Cal and you steal everything that you can, right? You see stuff at conferences, you read triphasic, you implement it, but there's still some moments when you're going through various manuals or you're seeing his content that he's putting on YouTube, his exercises, and you're thinking to yourself like what? Like what? How do you get to something like that? How do you go from doing a barbell split squat or a safety bar split squat to just smacking a band? Like, what are we doing here? How does this work? How do you progress? What's the path to get to something like that? So I went into Revolutions in Speed with kind of this, not necessarily confusion, but just the path wasn't laid out clear for me. And from going into that conference with a lot of the things I've learned from Dan, especially on Patreon, I finally wrote it out. And I wrote out a progression of how you could go from walking in the weight room with a beginner and doing ISOs all the way to Cal Dietz, peaking manual, smacking bands with weights in your hand or weights on your feet. Since then, since that conference over the last year, on Patreon, I've learned way more of Dan's system. So I realized in the progression I wrote out, I had skipped a lot of steps, but still that was kind of the catalyst for helping me put just these different systems out there together and something that can work for my athletes. Before I go any further, a little warning here. As I continue in this video, I will not be listing out every small detail of this kind of progression or series. Number one, for time, but then number two, this is not my material to be giving away. Subscribe to Want to Get Fast on Patreon. Every month, Dan will break things down in much greater detail and much better than I could in a small video. Highly suggest and recommend that. So now this progression, with everything I've learned from Dan, it all has to start with posture and position. And that's what his first ever Patreon post is about. Someone comes in, establish their posture and positions first, because athletes must understand positioning and how to get in and out of it, where their body's supposed to be before you could add on complexity, right? If we're taking Little League football, you have to first teach them where to line up before you could actually implement a play. Another example here in the weight room, take something as simple as a push-up. Athletes must have good posture and position while doing that before you can progress to anything with an altitude drop or something with a band or some sort of plyometric like a clapping push-up. Again, you have to have good posture and position. If you have athletes doing push-ups and they are flexing their necks down towards the ground or they're losing control of their hips, they're not ready for progression or something more advanced yet. Take the time to fix and ingrain good posture and position. And then start to think to yourself, what's the best way to do that? Isometrics. Isometrics are one of the best motor learning tools that we have to help establish and learn and teach posture and position to new athletes or even more advanced athletes. Even recently for me in my continuing education, I purchased and started up an Alex Natera isometrics course. And again, talks about holding isometrics. For posture and position, when you're trying to teach things, have athletes hold these positions for 30 seconds to a minute. Really establish and ingrain that motor task that you are wanting from them. And then once we think about classic weight room, once postures and positions are established, then we take our athletes through a series or progression of overloading them. In these video clips that are rolling right now, you're going to see an exercise that I stole from Chris Corfist and I applied Dan's concepts to. So this exercise, Chris Corfist would call ankle rocker jumps, I hope. I don't know, I've never had it kind of confirmed with him, but ankle rocker jumps is kind of the basis of this, and again, applying some of Dan's concepts. Now, we didn't start here, but soon after this kind of spot in the progression, I was able to introduce a banded version where, as you can see in these exercises, the athlete's feet are leaving the ground, they're pulling themselves down. But in a banded version now, we're gonna have the band pulling them down faster than gravity. Again, kind of a concept that I'm stealing from Dan. Now, most people will see this on the internet and just jump right into it. Maybe not the best idea. It was weeks and maybe even months in the making for me, developing everything I wanted for these athletes. So don't just jump right into something like this. In next week's video, I will take you through my entire progression of an exercise that I stole from Chris Corfist, and again, applied a lot of Dan Fichter's and Cal Dietz's concepts too. But to just kind of recap, when we are starting with a fresh athlete and then we eventually want to progress them over a series of weeks, months, or maybe even years, the first thing we have to do is establish posture and position. Use isometrics to make the shapes that you want from your athletes to be able to get into and out of. That kind of attractor position, if we bring in some Franz Bosch concepts, things that I've learned from Chris Corfist. Then from there, can they get in and out of those positions fast? Then from there, can we start to add a little bit more reactivity to it, right? Can we drop down into it and react off of it? Can we start to introduce some altitude training concepts where they are dropping into these postures and positions and being able to not deform or not lose position with external stressors kind of being applied to it? Then we start to speed those up a bit, speed them up so much to the point where we now are introducing banded concepts to either overload the eccentric or the concentric sort of portion of that, as well as, I guess you could call it the amortization phase, the isometric as well. And that was the big kind of revelation I had of, oh, here's a series of progressions of you start with isos, and eventually we could get to Cal's kind of peaking method concept. A reminder, please share some of the things that Dan and Want to Get Fast have taught you. Subscribe to them on Patreon and purchase any of the resources talked about and discussed today, be it Track and Football Consortium replays or any of Cal's products available on CoachTube. Thanks for watching Fichter Friday.